Okay, so it's Kathleen Gallagher from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto.
Hi, I'm Rachel King and I am an assistant professor in creativity, performance and education at the Centre for Education Studies at the University of Warwick.
Hi, I'm Emily Temple. I'm a PhD student at the Centre for Education Studies at the University of Warwick.
So welcome, both of you. Despite the formality of this, I really actually hope that we can have a quite informal conversation.
Okay.
And I know it's unfair of me to ask you to try to distill and process what, for me, certainly has been an extremely intense and challenging and rewarding and complex week of cross-cultural conversation and generating ideas together and apart. And I wanted to ask both of you if you could, at this point, at this near end point, but not at the end, at this stage in your thinking, what do you think would be the most poignant or important learnings that you have made this week that you will take home with you?
That's a lovely question. I think as well, the fact that we've still got our presentation to go is an interesting thing, because we've been continually talking the whole time about how what we thought was our analysis has been shifted and changed by the various conversations that have happened, not just in the presentations, but the whole experience of being here. So given that shifted perspective on everything, I think a striking thing for me has been, and I say striking actually, but I need to qualify that, because in a way I did expect and anticipate that I'd be bowled over by the range of contexts in which we are doing this work, and how that then changes how you view your own work. But I think I'll stick with that. So as much as I did expect it to be given an insight, to be given that window into the diversity of practice and the diversity of context, I think is so important. I think it's left me slightly uncomfortable sometimes, because I know for a number of reasons, and we'll explain this in our presentation, you know, we weren't working in a school that maybe has some of the shared challenges or the explicit shared challenges that have been communicated throughout the week.
And like what? An example?
So let's go for Toronto first then. So, you know, that the multicultural context in which that work is located, and then the emergent themes around race and how that was navigated by the teacher, by the students, by you as researchers. That has always been my place in my own research. That's something that I deal with typically in my research, but it wasn't the case for us. So that's one distinction that I would make. And then of course, you know, with Avashi's context, you are dealing with life and death in a way that we can't profess to be, and nor would we want to be. I mean, that's the whole point. She's trying to make a direct impact on this very risky business. She's also got the advantage of knowing those children over a long period of time, right? I mean, that those relationships, those bonds, that cultural context in which she is working is so different. Then we shifted to Taiwan, and again those stories of social injustices that are hushed up, that are quieted, silenced in some way, and how the drama space gives a voice to this. Really exciting, but also again wasn't really our experience in this particular school. And then again today we heard from the Athens site, and as I mentioned during the discussion, you know, I know a little bit about this because I have friends who are suffering. And I've always been amazed by the capacity for action from my friends and colleagues to work without money, without funds. It's mind-blowing. So, they are dealing with that crisis. And then another crisis that they've inherited is obviously the refugee crisis, which I know wasn't specific to their presentation, but was part of that context. So I think, given sometimes the severity of those social, cultural issues, it then puts into, you can't help but then go, is ours not cutting edge enough? Is it not, are these kids worthy of being part of this study? But then I know my teacher instinct, my drama instinct is absolutely they are, because you only have to watch back the video, and we'll show this tomorrow, of those moments where they are saying this is about life and death in their own ways.
I want to, and I'm going to come back to you, Emily, but I want to validate what you said, because there's so much internal negotiating we're all doing when we're trying to appreciate the context of another, and we can't help but compare our own, right? At the same time, in an increasingly globalized world, we stand in direct relationship to those stories. They are not other, even though the stakes and the consequences are differently experienced. We are also in the business of reconciling our relationship to that. And the other thing I want to say is, this research has to be an important counter to the trauma industry. It has to be a piece of research that does not reproduce the narratives of injury and drama as the cure-all of the ills of the world, and especially the most serious conflicts and disasters in the world. So, it's every bit as important that England and Canada perceived to be not in the same life-death situations, and Taiwan as well, to be at the same table, not absenting ourselves, not paralyzed by guilt and our sense of privilege, but in a genuine dialogue and exchange across those major inequalities that get reproduced even in our discourses together.
I think that's how you've put that so much better, but
that's exactly
that's my feel, that you have to have anchor points, right? And you have to have, it comes back to my thing about principles. Our contexts are different, but our principles are the same. We still want, or similar, let's say, we still want those, to create spaces where those particular young people that you're working with feel valued and feel that their voice is important, and
and that they bear a responsibility to people who don't share their privileges and their trials, right? I mean, this is not straightforward work that we're doing. Emily,
and on those lines, one of the things that I think has been what struck me the most are the resonances amongst all of the groups. That yes, we have different cultural contexts. Yes, there are more weights in play in certain areas, but the resonance with the students and the fact that this was a space that gave them voice, and this project was a way of giving them voice to talk about things they normally don't get to speak about, and the relief that they have felt through going through this process and having those moments and having people listen to what they were going to say, no matter what that story was, whether it was Ravashi students or Wanjun's, and each place they were taking the time and given the respect to tell their story, and it was listened to and recorded, and the shock those students had seeing their words played back is something that I think each of the sites have spoken to, that those students appreciated the way that those things were recorded, and that was something that certainly was true for us, that we've seen in the responses from our students, which we'll talk about more tomorrow, and the similarities that have come up from each separate group and all of those contexts, that despite those ranges we've gotten similar results in some ways. The importance of giving that space and the structures in the pedagogy to create that space, how we model that, how we support that, how we keep that safe, like the principles that we created to make that space possible to get those results from those students has been consistent. And it was something I was not expecting to have that much of a resonance from each place.
That's interesting. So I'm not sure who brought this up today, but we've all of us been through processes of the struggle to communicate, the struggle to be heard, the struggle to be understood in our own terms. If we wanted to amplify that process with the students and the theater makers that we work with, what kinds of steps do you think we need to take so that what we don't do, which happens commonly in these kinds of projects, is reduce our own local contexts to cultural stereotypes to be easily digested by others?
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to have the answer, but
Yeah.
how do we talk about this, and how do we not just take that as a caution, but what steps do we take? And they may be pedagogical, they may be based in practice, they may be political and value based, they may be questions of methodology and research. There are so many angles that we can take to try to not reproduce the massive inequalities and the misrecognitions that we know are flourishing in popular media and in all kinds of other ways. So we want to resist, and sometimes in our attempts, this is me just bearing my worst nightmare scenario, that we actually reduce. We pay a disservice to the complexity of our local contexts in order to make ourselves appreciable to some imagined other that we also have in a way reified, so that and we not just make less complex, but in fact less dimensional, so that we set that up as the terms of our communication. How can we do it? What should we do? Small steps, big steps, research in the research sense or the practice sense. What are some of the kinds of things we can do together to not reproduce those dangers?
I think that's, gosh, it's actually a question that I think all academic researchers should ask themselves. So I think it's a brilliant question. And certainly I don't know so much about North America, but I know increasingly now in academia we're being asked to engage with the public. Public engagement is the term used. And it's funny because for us in the education and to some extent the drama department, our work is always publicly engaged. So it's so fascinating at the moment because there's all this push and this agenda to have impact in the work, to make that communication, from the cradle to the end of, cradle to grave of a project. That's totally the wrong thing. Grave, very depressing. I don't mean that
idea.
At all. In the cycle of the research project is what I mean. There's this emphasis on, or push now to, we've got to connect with a public, and I find it really funny, actually. It is really funny because you get, sorry to say, but a lot of scientists kind of really panicked about how they're going to make this research knowable and recognisable to supposed, publics. And also, actually, funding is dependent on it. So
here as well.
Yeah, right. So it's part of a bigger agenda around what research is for and who is it for and why do we do it. So I think maybe to try and relate that wider picture to what we're doing, I think it is about working out what the, maybe, with the public engagement strategies, it's very much seen, as I understand it, to be outcomes of research, whereas I wonder if one of the strengths of our project is that we can invite students and teachers in to be part of and integral to that work, and without them actually the research doesn't happen. And so then that dissemination of the knowledge should be a more fluid thing. And actually, is it maybe about us, one of the things I wanted to ask you about next year's project is, if we change context, if I go 20 minutes down the road from where I've just been doing this work, I would be in an entirely different context. I'm thinking of another school that I work with a lot. So is it then about making sure that this work, the long-term project actually reaches out to more than just one type of school, to more than one type of public? And I'm even thinking of, and again, we need to ask you about this, but to actually move out of a school context and into a youth theatre context. So maybe it's about finding a diversity of publics with whom we can collaborate, with whom we make part of, integral in that project, in that process. So it's not just you're there to say, look at this lovely research that I've done, here it is at the end of it. They are fundamental to the negotiation of that practice. And then that's also, you can make that into a teaching and learning strategy as well.
Absolutely.
Bringing in students. That's one of the reasons why Emily is here, is because, it's so hard for researchers to get into schools and to find, long-term projects that you can actually do. So this was, came along at a very good time for you when you were facing a crisis. So it's kind of like, well, we want to make this happen. Let's make this happen.
And there needs to be space in the conversation for that as well, to talk about the issues within the process instead of just the product itself. There's so much within research. It's about, oh, this is the product, this is what I have to show you, this is the end goal, these are the important bits that you want for funding, the things you can quantify, the things you can write up in a nice, neat package, where a lot of the things that get you to that point of knowing and the point of projecting these things is the process itself and the struggles you go through in facing that, of having access to students, of having collaboration with those students and teachers, and what those teachers need in that space. And I feel like that's something that's just as important to have in the write-ups and have in general knowledge, is to talk about those struggles and the steps that are taken, the way you adjust things, the negotiations that happen between practitioners and researchers and the students. All of those things that are in together that can be quite messy, but are still points of value that show why those things work and why you get those outcomes. And I think that also would keep it from becoming something that's perpetuated of, this is a magical form, look at the good we can do from this. I think showing those difficulties.
I mean, you're raising so many points and questions that I would love to address, and this is obviously going to be an important conversation as we consider moving forward. But some of the things, we're borrowing from very old traditions and relatively old traditions in scholarship about participatory research. These are not new ideas. Action research with teachers. I mean, these forms of research that are not about disseminating your findings at the end point have a long tradition in certain kinds of critical scholarship. So we're in that world already. But to get to your question about publics, which I think is a really, really key one, not just to secure grants, but to do what we want to do, which is to leverage ideas in the world, not to present a miracle solution to anything. And so, and not just any ideas. So in the context of ethnographic work, which is over years of time, I mean, it's a luxury and a burden to have that kind of time to, I consider it always a luxury, but it does mean that you are making judgment calls at critical points and doing an assessment about, in a sense, to put it crudely, where you need to do the most good, who you need to serve, who you need to partner with so that they can better articulate experiences that are of value to the world. And so if you move from, there's an advantage to having 3 or 4 years to build a real relationship with a school. You can do that, but you can also say, my deeper understanding of the project and the ways that we work maybe should travel to another school or to a theater. I mean, I said that to you from the start. You can actually, it will make lots of sense to be in a school because there are instant comparators across sites, but there's no demand on you, because what we're really interested in is working with, collaborating with young people. And we know that the contexts set up all of the possibilities and limitations of what kind of contact that will be, but we don't have in mind a particular context that is either the most fruitful or the most, this is not a comparative study. So we will always be in the game of trying to make our contexts knowable to distant others and to less distant others. That's always going to be what's at play. So I feel like, you know, you, after this, you have a lot of questions to answer for yourselves. And part of the way we work as a research team is to take on board our reads of our own local contexts so that we can do the best work we can do. And sometimes that means with the teachers who can afford to be most engaged, whose institutional cultures give them that space to breathe and to engage in this way. That's why we have artists as part of our collaborative. That's why we're working with theaters and constant with artists, because there's a lot we don't share, but there's a whole lot that we do share if we find ourselves, again, in that conversation of you call it principles, I might call it collectively shared visions or aspirations or political alternatives. And we don't just find that in our own neat institutional contexts. In fact, we often don't. So seeking out and saying, what are the working contexts that will allow us to push these ideas and these practices as far as we possibly can within the limits of the research? Let's make that happen.
Yeah, I think as well, you know, because we're talking within this week about Taipei, Athens, Toronto, Warwick, you know, there's a danger perhaps that we then do what you were saying before, Kathleen, about we then, when this work is then produced as research, that site comes to stand for that entire geographical location, whereas I've just been to a school however many minutes away, 10 minutes away, that's entirely different to the school that I went to on Tuesday, or Monday. So, you know, it would be, you know, you